Greetings. This is Father Harvey Henderson at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Grand Forks, continuing today with our careful reading of the Gospel of Matthew. This is chapter 18. Chapter 18 is the fourth of five collections of sayings of Jesus that Matthew has. The first is the familiar Sermon on the Mount in chapters 5 through 7. And then chapter 10, a collection of instruction for the disciples as they go out into the world. And chapter 13, a collection of parables, many of which are familiar to us. So here in chapter 18, we have a collection of sayings on the subject of humility and forgiveness. We begin with verses 1 through 7, where Jesus compares the kingdom of heaven to being like little children. He chooses a rather vulnerable and totally dependent group of people to show us what the kingdom of heaven is like. The weakest and most vulnerable, least significant you can think of, is the clearest signpost, Jesus, as to what the kingdom of heaven will be like. And if you consider the lives of little children, how, especially in their early days, they are totally dependent upon their parents and their caregivers for their existence. Likewise, folks are to be in that kind of relationship with God, totally dependent upon God for their well-being. So humility is what Jesus says counts in the kingdom of heaven. Those who were become humble like the child, he says, is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And he has a dire warning for any folks who place a stumbling block in the way of these little children. And when we consider the children here, we also consider those who are most vulnerable in our world, the elderly, the sick, particularly these days, those who are suffering from the effects of the COVID virus. These are the ones that Jesus has in mind. And this, again, this stark warning of putting the millstone around your neck and throwing you into the deepest part of the sea is not a literal punishment that Jesus is suggesting, but again, using this idea of exaggeration or hyperbole to make his point and how serious it is. So he's cautioning his disciples that these are the most vulnerable and these are the most cherished in the kingdom of heaven. More in verses 8 through 14 about these little ones. And again, this idea of cutting off your hand or your foot is this idea of exaggeration Jesus is using to make his point. We do that in our own everyday conversation as well. So take care, he says, you do not despise any one of these little ones, for the angels are continually see the face of my Father in heaven. Normally, in the Old Testament stories, the angels cover their faces with their wings so that they do not see the face of the face of God. But here, this is the one that these are the ones that matters. These angels are not covering their faces, but are in the direct presence of God in heaven. So we also have here in this little section a more familiar saying of Jesus about the 99 and the one. Again, an indication that Jesus is concerned about each of us as individuals. It would be easy to say in the story that, well, we have 99 out of 100, let's just forget the one, but Jesus reminds us of the importance of each individual so that there's more rejoicing in heaven over the 99 that never went astray than over for the one that is found, rather than of the 99 who were not lost. Verses 15 through 20 is a familiar passage in the Gospel of Matthew, and it gives us a model for reconciliation and forgiveness, which is even appropriate for our own day. The first step, Jesus says, that if you have a conflict with one of your with another individual, the first thing to do is to go and see that person one-on-one. We all know that when we've been hurt or are harmed in some kind of way, that this one-on-one conversation can be very difficult, and Jesus calls us to do that first step. If that doesn't work, however, he recommends then taking one or two other folks to have a kind of objective look at the conflict that is going on between the two individuals, hopefully an unbiased outside party. We might say often pastors are involved in this kind of reconciliation in marriage relationships and at other times. If this second step doesn't work, then he suggests taking it to the church, to the community, and having the grievance aired in that particular context. And lastly, again, there's this harsh judgment. If this does not work, the one-on-one and the two or three others, and then taking it to the church, then he again suggests a rather harsh kind of solution, and that is that this person become an outcast in the community. I have heard of rare situations in which this has had to happen in congregations, for example, when one or two people are like a poison in that community and have to be asked to leave for a time being. Forgiveness, however, still being the ultimate goal of that. Verses 21 through 35, we preached about this passage not too long ago, but it's this story when the disciples ask, how many times must we forgive? 7 times, and Jesus says not 7, but 70 times 7. It's again not a literal interpretation that we ought to count the number of times, and Jesus is saying, actually, if you're counting the number of times you must forgive, you're not really understanding what forgiveness is about. And he tells this story then of the kingdom of heaven, once again, to a king who wanted to settle accounts with his slaves. And again, here we have this idea of exaggeration. The 10,000 talents that the servant owes the king is an extraordinary amount, just an exaggeration again of a debt that is totally unpayable. And so when the servant asks for mercy, the king grants mercy and forgives the debt completely. And then that particular servant goes to another servant who indeed owes him a much smaller amount of money and does not forgive, and has the man thrown into prison until he can pay. When the king hears of that change of heart by the servant who has been forgiven, he then went and had him thrown into prison until he would pay the debt. So then his Lord summoned him and said to him, "You wicked slave, I forgave you all of this." And in his anger, he handed him over to be tortured. Well, again, he's not being tortured for his refusal to forgive in this particular situation. So Jesus is again making the point about the nature of forgiveness, and that this is indeed at the heart of our Christian community. We begin each service of Holy Communion in our Episcopal tradition with an act of public confession and forgiveness. The prayer that we use every day asks us to forgive the sins of others as we indeed are forgiven our sins by God. I remember reading many years ago a novel about a man who had not felt forgiven of something that happened in his very early life, and what a disaster this had on his life as he grew up into adulthood. But the metaphor there that's stuck in my mind is that God's forgiveness is like this. Our sin is like a hot coal, And forgiveness, God's forgiveness, is when we throw the hot coal into the sea of God's forgiveness. The hot coal disappears, the sin is forgiven, but God's endless forgiveness for us is not changed by throwing that hot coal into the sea. Professor Wright, in his commentary on this particular chapter, has a line that's stuck in my mind, and it's this. Forgiveness, he says, is more like the air in our lungs. There's only room to inhale the next lungful when we've breathed out the previous one. So this idea of forgiving and forgetting is not what Jesus has in mind. And again, this prayer that we use in the Lord's Prayer, the prayer of forgiveness, is not a conditional forgiveness. It's not asking God to forgive us if and only if we forgive others. God's love and mercy and forgiveness for us is unconditional. It is an act of grace, as my Lutheran friends would have us understand. But this idea that there's only room in our hearts to receive God's forgiveness when we empty our heart and forgive those who are around us. Again, this is much perhaps easier to say than to do, but Jesus, in this particular collection of sayings in chapter 18, is once again reaffirming that he is establishing God's new covenant with Israel and with the world, and that at the heart of this new covenant with Israel in the world, this new way of life, is this idea of forgiveness. There are many examples in our world about the need for forgiveness. Some of the classic ones, are the victims of the Holocaust to forgive their abusers, are the victims of 9/11, the survivors to forgive the terrorists who killed their loved ones. These are huge, difficult questions for us to consider. One more meaningful example for me is several years ago, there was a shooting at an Amish community in Pennsylvania where a man broke into a school and killed several young girls and then took his own life. This story made both the religious and the secular news in that the Amish community, who very much value their privacy but who have a very strong prohibition against vengeance or revenge and not forgiving, issued a public statement that they had in fact forgiven the man who killed their children. A startling kind of example of folks who actually live what Jesus commanded us in this particular chapter and elsewhere in the gospel stories. The story continues there that this family, the parents of the young man who killed the children, was taken in by this Amish community, and they established a lifelong relationship with them, recognizing that they too had lost a child that particular day. So this idea of forgiveness, we pray every day for this kind of forgiveness, and Jesus uses these examples and this point of exaggeration that we ought to be like little children, totally dependent upon God for our existence. We ought to be humble in our relationship with God, and this is indeed not a difficult thing for us, not an easy thing for us human beings to do. We have a tendency to be more self-centered and less humble, and to put our dependence upon God alone is indeed a difficult thing for us to do. So here then is chapter 18, the fourth of these great collections of the sayings of Jesus. Again, this five-fold collection is what many folks think is Jesus being like the new Moses, those first 5 books of the Old Testament, the New Testament law or the Torah or the teaching. Matthew very much sees Jesus as the new Moses in his time and generation. That's all for chapter 18. Take care and be well. God bless.